Today's webinar is Creating Assessments for Differentiated Instruction, and our presenter is Ann Jung from the University of Kentucky, the College of Education there. So let me tell you a little bit about Leanne, whom I've worked with before, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and that's why I can assure you that you're in for a very, very informative and important webinar today. Leanne, as I said, is a professor at the Ed School at the University of Kentucky. She's worked in the field of special education since 1994 as a teacher, an administrator, a researcher, and an interventionist. Leanne stays actively involved in schools and districts. She supports standards-based assessment, families, IEP development, planning intervention, and measuring progress. Leanne works both internationally and in the U.S. I believe she's just come back from Istanbul. Leanne's also an independent consultant and has been one since 1999. Leanne's co-authored and/or authored 4 books. So, without any further introduction, I will introduce Leanne, and I'm going to disappear and Leanne will appear.
Hi everyone. So glad you could join us this afternoon for a conversation on differentiating our assessments. I was glad that Adrian asked me to think about this topic. I've spent a lot of time thinking about grading and how we score our assessments, but I'm excited to think about ways that we can give people a structure for thinking about the types of changes that we're making and how that impacts different learners, which learners need differentiated assessments, and so forth. And so this afternoon, our learning targets are first to describe some of the features of solid assessment practices. I had 5. We're only going to talk about 4 because I thought we would run out of time. And so we'll talk about some of the many features that we could think about with regard to just solid assessment practices for all learners. And these solid assessment practices are necessary. They are a necessary foundation on which we build high-quality assessments for struggling and exceptional learners. We'll think about who needs differentiated assessments. Is it only those students with IEPs, or do other students need differentiated assessments? What are we allowed to do in terms of modifications or accommodations? And then we'll talk about 3 different ways that we can differentiate assessments, and within that, one piece that is critical that we understand is the difference between accommodations and modifications. This is something that a lot of people are not clear on. In fact, even groups of special educators are often not clear on the difference between accommodations and modifications. And the reason for this? Our paperwork doesn't compel us to know the difference between them. Often we see on IEPs, what accommodations/modifications does this student need? And so we don't really have to think about whether we're providing accommodations or modifications in our curriculum. But accommodating and providing modifications to our assessments means something very different. So we're going to think about that and the implications for that within your classroom assessments, and we'll talk briefly about what that means for standardized assessments. And we'll think about a structure for being able to organize our decisions around whether we're making accommodations or modifications for struggling or exceptional learners. The first piece of setting a solid foundation of assessment is that we have to understand that traditional assessments have a limited role. So often for those students who have disabilities, we test them. We test them to make sure that they qualify for special education, for example. But it's important to never allow that traditional measure to limit what we go for in the general education classroom. So many times we lean too heavily on these traditional assessments. And so I'd like to tell you a story about Micah to inspire you to think higher and to think about going for deeper learning targets for students, even those who are struggling and have disabilities. So this is Micah. Micah is from Michigan. His mom, Janice Fialka, is my friend. And Micah went to school in Michigan. Micah has cognitive disabilities, intellectual impairment, if you will, and received special education services in Michigan his entire time in school. And this is Micah when he was college age. He asked his family, he wanted to go to college. He wanted to have a college experience. Now, because of Micah's disability, he was not eligible to be a degree-seeking student. He did not meet the requirements for college entry. As many students with more significant disabilities, that's the case. But he wanted a college experience, and we all know that some of the best things that you learn in college have nothing to do with your degree anyway, right? And Micah wanted that experience. And so his parents said, sure. They approached Oakland University. Oakland University said, okay, this is an innovative thought, but we want to create an experience for Micah and students like Micah. Then Micah said, well, I want to live in the dorm. And they said, no, you're not a degree-seeking student. You can't live in the dorm. Well, Micah said, I want to sue them then. His parents were raging war protesters back in the day. He got a little bit of that and said, I want to sue Oakland University. And so they won. And this is a picture of Micah the day he moved into the dorm. And it set a nice precedent for people with disabilities everywhere. So through that process, Micah began presenting with his mom. His mom talks a lot about parent-professional partnerships. And he began presenting with Janice, and he presented on what it's like to be a person with a disability, with an intellectual disability, which is probably not what we would have imagined Micah doing. Well, it gets better. Syracuse University heard about what Micah was doing, presenting, and said, we want Micah. We want to hire Micah to be an assistant on our faculty so that he can teach our students studying to be special education teachers what it's like, and to have that important perspective. So Micah began to orchestrate his own move from Michigan to New York, and in that process, his parents needed to dig up his old test scores. They needed to dig up those scores so that he could access services for people with disabilities in New York. You want to guess what Micah's IQ score is? Everybody, just quickly, just for fun, put in the IQ score in the text box that you think Micah may have had. Remembering that 100 is the mean. Uh-oh, it says chat text disabled, so maybe that didn't work out. So, all right, so hopefully everybody has the number in their mind. And I can see a few of those numbers here, 75, 55, 110, 150. He did have intellectual disability. And so because we know intellectual disability in special education means an IQ score of 70 or below, we know it was below 70. And I think most people would guess it was somewhere around there. And every 15 points below 100 is a standard deviation below the mean. I'm seeing lots of 60s, mid-50s. Okay, Stella from Argentina, you win the gold star. Micah's IQ score was 40. All right, so I think those of us who have served on IEP meetings, I think you would have seen a score of 40 and I would have even, as a special education teacher, probably would not have imagined this future for Micah. And so it is vital that we understand as classroom teachers that our traditional assessments, those scores that get kids into special education, that's the only purpose they serve. Kathy Snow, who talks a lot about disability and access and our services, she says that labels are socio-political passports to services. And I would expand that to say These scores here, Micah's score of 40 was a socio-political passport to services. It allowed him to receive the services he needed. But if I kept looking at that 40, I don't see Micah really well right now, do you? That 40 is in the way. I need to put that 40 aside so I can see Micah and understand his strengths. He had intellectual disability, a significant intellectual disability, but he had interest in telling other people about it and informing other people, and like his mom, was interested in being a presenter. And so we need to remember that for the students we serve, that those numbers are socio-political passports to services. Second, and this is really true not for just struggling and exceptional learners, but for all learners, percentages are not a defensible way to summarize learning. And if you have, if you've worked with me or been in sessions with me before, we talk a lot about report cards and how percentages aren't the right numbers to put on a report card. It's really smoke and mirrors. We can't really say that a student has 75% learning toward the target. But it's also not the right way to score individual assignments or assessments or tests or any kind of individual piece of work. A percentage is not the right way to characterize learning. Oftentimes, when we're calculating a percentage, what we're doing is we're calculating the percentage of items correct, or we come up with some complicated formula, and we are a slave to that formula. This is not a defensible way, even from a measurement perspective. This is not a philosophy. I'm not talking about the philosophy of standards-based grading. What we're saying is that we need to characterize learning. And Michael, it seems as though a percent toward a learning target is something we can do better. You're right, we do need to quantify, but this is not the right way to quantify learning. We don't have a ratio or interval level of data, and so it's not appropriate to calculate a percentage. What we have is ordinal level of data, and so we can take an individual piece of work. Let's think about a math paper or a language arts paper, or for those of you working with younger children, we can think of some sort of performance assessment that you may score. And more useful than calculating the number right or wrong is to classify what knowledge, skills, and processes that the student demonstrated. So in my classes, one of the classes that I teach is on how to design intervention plans. And so I teach students, college-age students, how to write plans. They write goals for students with disabilities. They select an intervention and they take data. And I used to have a complicated formula, and I would come up with a grade that was a percentage. And in learning more and more about appropriate ways to measure, I've realized that I can ditch that, I should ditch that, and I can do something that's much more meaningful and much easier. And every assignment now that students turn into me at the college level, so I can do this at the college level within our rigid grading scales and so forth. Most people have the flexibility to do this. So I grade every single assignment 1, 2, or 3. And I can map out exactly what these words look like for each assignment. But a 3 means exemplary. You got it. I don't see any need for improvement to meet the standard. A 2 means that there is a need for minimum improvements. There's a need for some improvement, and then a 1 means there's a need for major improvements. Maybe you didn't understand the task, or for whatever reason you're very far off from being on track, and we need to get together. So every assignment I score is a 1, 2, or 3 based on the standard, and it's important to know that sometimes the assessments that you design, that some of the assessments you design, you're scoring on multiple standards, and that's fine. I can give a 1, 2, or 3 on how well they wrote the goal, and I can give a 1, 2, or 3 on how the intervention strategies look. So describe and not prescribe. I like that cell, to describe and not prescribe what a student knows and is able to do. Yeah, so we're not just mindlessly calculating items correct or incorrect. We're really thinking about what level of proficiency did this student demonstrate. So mine are, what level of revisions are needed. You might have another type of scale. You might have a 4-point scale where 4 is exemplary, 3 is approaching the standard. You might have different words. And these are typically the words and descriptions we're using in standards-based reporting. If this is really new for you, you might want to read some about standards-based grading and reporting. And what we do is we take those scales, those descriptors of performance, levels of proficiency, and we layer that over every assessment that we score. Yes, we do need to help parents understand what the assessments mean, whether it's formative, summative, or even homework. And I'm glad, Peggy, that you brought up the formative and summative issue. Yes, we need to characterize the learning, and it doesn't matter if it's a formative point in time or a summative point in time. I don't have different assessments for summative and formative. They still complete the intervention plan. But up until the end of the semester, it is a formative experience. And that grade can change throughout the semester. So how do I convert that to a final grade? That's a great question. I want to scroll up. What do you do when your parents turn rubrics into a percent? It takes some time to change that culture. You're exactly right. It does take some time to change that culture. And how do you turn it into a final grade? So within my classes, and again, this is not what I suggest you do, it's just what I do, and there's probably even a better way to do it within your context. You know your context, your context better. Lisa, yes, we do use more specific language in the rubric, but it all fits within that scale, within that 3-point scale. And at the end of the semester, in order to receive an A in my class, students have to have a 3 on every single assignment. The deal is that they get to revise those with my feedback as often as they like to get there. And they want to get there as quickly as possible because it takes more work if they require multiple revisions. So you're right, you all, it is a culture change, and I want to acknowledge the importance of that and the difficulty of that, complex nature of that. But in short, what we're saying is your brain is a better tool than a calculator. It is more reliable than a calculator. We could do an exercise to demonstrate how difficult it would be for you and a colleague to arrive at the same percentage score. But if we give levels of proficiency and clear descriptors, you can arrive at that. And for those of you using rubrics, you're right on track there. We just don't want to go from the awesome rubric into some sort of percentage to get a grade. We want to stick with the integrity of that rubric and what it means. And yes, redos and retakes, we could make that 0.5 that we're not getting to this afternoon, but redos and retakes are an important foundation in high quality assessment. The third piece is that our assessments need to have the same level of depth and complexity as our learning target in order to be able to diagnose and intervene. We all know about Bloom's taxonomy. We all know that our learning targets, when we think about all of the standards, international, national standards that we're using to design our learning targets, that we are trying to push students to analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and we need to make sure that our assessments do the same. Our assessments need to not be rooted in recall. Our tasks need to be pushing students to higher levels, which often means going beyond our traditional tests. So the person who asked, do we continue to reassess until mastery? That's really what we're talking about. We're talking about fostering mastery, not just characterizing performance and moving on. So the best way to assess students with ADD, dyslexia, or other learning disabilities, we're going there. We're just still in the foundations right now. So, all right, so we said that. So the fourth point And this one can be tricky, especially for those of you who are secondary educators and you have many students. I can give you an idea of how I do this. But you never want to give a score without feedback. We never ever want to give a student a score without clear feedback on how that student can perform. Lois, yes, there's a lot of talk about the revised Bloom's taxonomy. Tom Guskey is my colleague. He was a student of Mr. Bloom, Dr. Bloom, and Tom has a lot of reasons to believe that the revised taxonomy is not what he would support. I don't think within our context of what we're talking about today that it matters which of those you use, just the point being that we want to reflect whatever our learning target level is in Bloom's taxonomy. We want to reflect that level, or if you use Webb's depth of knowledge, whatever you use to guide that thinking around complexity, we want the same within our assessments. But good question, good thought. And yes, Felicia, feedback is crucial. Renee, you'll have to ask, do I do what with exams? So give me a little bit more information there. We do know from John Hattie's work on visible learning for teachers, he does a meta-analysis of many of the studies in education, and what we know is among the most powerful interventions available to us is our feedback. Our feedback is the most powerful, among the most powerful interventions available to us. Point 3 again, Kayla, was to ensure that our assessments reflect the same depth or complexity as our learning targets. Do we allow redos on exams or just homework? What about labs? You're a science teacher. So this really gets to this point of formative versus summative. And so instead of characterizing every assessment as either formative or summative, I really like to think about it, is this a formative point in time or a summative point in time? And when it is a summative point in time, that is the end. That is when we have to characterize where a student is right now. And exams are often given at those summative points in time. They're often cumulative. They should be one piece of data, and it shouldn't be exams count X percent and everything else counts this percent. That's back to the calculator problem. But it should be one piece of data we use in making a decision about where a student was at this point in time. How do I provide feedback to large amount of students? Ariel asks a great question when I have lots and lots of students. And it's not unrelated to Regina's question about how do we generate a desire in students to want and care about feedback. Let me answer Regina's first. How do we promote a desire for feedback? Well, when students see a score that gets averaged into a grade later on, they're not going to care about your feedback. They're going to think about, what do I need to get next in order to bring the grade up? But in my classes, my feedback lets you completely change your grade. Your new work completely replaces your old work. And so students do respond and want feedback. I recognize that I am teaching in a college environment, and that is very different than a public high school environment in which you may have students who've been disempowered, who don't feel they can succeed, and those create other issues. But I can tell you that when we take away the weight of this low grade that a student gets early on and say, hey, pay attention to this feedback and this grade can totally change, you will win a lot of desire and interest to change. So back to the question, how do I do this with so many students? You're telling me I can't ever give a score without feedback? Yes. And so one of the ways I do that, when I have hundreds of students, and some semesters I do, I often use what is called screencasting. And maybe you're familiar with this. There are many free programs out there. One of those is Jing, Jing.com. So, I said my name, sorry. So Jing, it's like my name, but with an I instead of a U. So Jing.com. That's an interesting question, Carolyn. You give feedback, but never thought of it as being changed. and or improve the grade. Great thought. So a lot of times we give feedback, and the purpose of our feedback is to justify our grade. And we don't want our feedback to justify our grade. We want the feedback to fuel the learning, to fuel mastery, to tell students what they can do next. And even for those who've mastered it, tell them what they can do next. Tell them what they can explore and how they can even improve. So Renee put in screencast-o-matic.com. I don't know that one. Jing.com. There are lots of them out there. But for those of you who don't know what screencasting is, it's like having a camera on your shoulder pointed at your computer screen. And what students do, and this won't work for those of you who are teaching very young children and they're not turning in assignments online, but for those of you who are working with older students, you probably do have students using a learning management software program to turn in their work. If you don't, you might consider that. So I open up a document that a student submits, I turn on Jing, I capture that screen, and there Barbara has posted a link to screencasting tools, and I can talk. I give my feedback. So a student turns in an intervention plan, or they turn in a research paper. I can go through that paper. Have you ever thought while you're grading something, man, I wish the student could just be here right now? It would be so easy if they could just pop here right now and they could hear what I'm thinking as I go through it. Screencasting allows you to do that. So when I finish taking the video of my feedback, and again, the video is just of the computer screen, not of me, so you can do this in your jammies at home, I save the link and I pop that back in the learning management software program. So I might give a 2, which means minor improvements are needed, and I post a link within that student's feedback window to so that they can see the feedback and see me go through. And Lindsay is saying she uses QuickTime feedback. I don't know Kzena for audio feedback. Those of you who are using Canvas as your learning management software, there are lots of ways to use screencasting to give feedback. And I'll let Adrian answer if people will be able to see the links at the end. All right. So those are some of the many. I really had a hard time choosing which ones even to share with you, because there's so many gears that go together to form a solid foundation of assessment. But hopefully that gives you some ideas of things that you might do to even improve the excellent assessment foundation that you already have. So who needs differentiated assessments? Is this for students who have IEPs? Well, yes, it is true. Those students who have diagnosed disabilities do need differentiated assessments a lot of the time. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time. But also there are other learners in your classes who are struggling. Those students who are English learners and newly arrived struggle with the curriculum when they're newly arrived especially, right? They may have trouble all the way across the curriculum as they begin to get conversational English but are lacking in academic English. And then there are those students who you're considering to refer for special education. Great comment, Peggy. All students deserve differentiation. Yes, there's students who don't quite qualify for special education. There's students who go through an RTI process, and related to what Peggy said, students struggle. You all struggled. I struggled. We all struggled with some part of the curriculum at some point. And so who needs differentiated assessments? Any student who is significantly behind grade level on a critical skill. So, what did Stella say? Including gifted students. Okay, yeah, I would need to change this slide, wouldn't I? If we're going to make it apply to the other end of exceptionalities. And you're exactly right. I've got one of those in my house. In fact, in my house, I've got one who is gifted and has a learning disability. And so often people don't get that, though. They don't get that Spencer needs really challenging tasks, but he also needs modifications in the area of writing or extended time in order to read. They don't get that, because if you don't give him any differentiation, if you don't challenge him and you don't give him accommodations or modifications, he'll do okay. He'll get by. He'll pass. He'll do okay. And a lot of people don't get that that's what he needs. Absolutely, Brenda. You have people who, in every class, you have students who get things quicker and those who are needing some more work. And those who are behind the rest of the group, absolutely, you may need to differentiate in one of the ways that we talk about. Zelda, I love that. Behind or beyond? Behind or beyond. I think that's great. So even though we're talking about approximately 20% of the student population, we're talking about 100% of teachers needing to do this. So how do we do this? How do we change our assessments for exceptional learners in ways that are meaningful? And I am focusing more on students who are struggling, but I love that you are bringing in those students who are needing differentiated instruction and assessment because they are beyond. So sometimes when we modify assessments, we have to change the type of support. We have to change the way that we help students access the assessments. We provide accommodations so that they can have this access. Sometimes we have the same task, the same assessment, but we have to change a little bit about what we're measuring within that assessment. And Barbara has listed some differentiated, or given us a link to differentiated instructional strategies. That's great. Sometimes, and this is the rarest, but sometimes we have to give a completely different task. So if we organize our thinking about changing our assessments in this way, that for most students who are struggling or have disabilities, we just change the support we provide. We provide them with access, with accommodations. For fewer students, we may need to measure something different. We give the same task, but we may need to measure something different. And for the smallest number of students, we may need to give a different task. And you know, I wasn't really thinking about it for this lecture in terms of gifted students, or forget the label, for students who at any given point in time are far beyond grade level on tasks, but I like thinking about that. And so we may do the same thing. For students who are beyond, we may give the same task and measure something different. And I have an idea of one way that we do that. I'll talk about that when we get there. And then for some students, we may want to give a completely different task to that student. So I love that you're making those connections to your work with students who are beyond. So let's think first about support and access. And for this, we're really talking about providing accommodations. But to know what the accommodations are, we have to make sure we understand and are crystal clear on the difference between accommodations and modifications. So if nothing else, you will leave crystal clear on the difference between these two types of adaptations. So when I use the word adaptations, we're using that as an umbrella term to mean accommodations or modifications. Yes, Peggy, and I feel that all the time. Nothing more frustrating than for brilliant students in mathematics, thinking, and problem solving to struggle with and be evaluated on their reading ability. Absolutely. All right, so Farhana is already making kind of a guess. Different would be modifications. Here are some common adaptations you all see in the classroom on assessments. We might allow a student to complete an assignment or a project orally. So let's say that there's a writing task, and for a student who's an English learner, we allow that student to complete the task orally and maybe complete some sort of visual project and describe it instead. We might give a student fewer questions or fewer prompts. Prompts, I don't mean prompts like special ed support, I mean prompts like questions. Fewer writing prompts, for example. Or I might give a student extended time either to complete a project, so more days or weeks to complete a project, or I might give more minutes on a timed type of test. All right, so you all are making some good guesses here. So let's think about this for just a minute. And I'm going to open a poll here because There are lots of you on here, and this will be the easiest way to keep the data. All right, so think about those adaptations to yourself. I'm going to open a poll, so you don't need to respond in the text box, but I'm going to ask you which each of these is. All right? So is completing an assignment orally an accommodation or a modification? I like that question, Rebecca. Let's come to that after we go through the discussion of accommodations and modification. Visual exams using pictures I didn't see the rest of it. Using pictures to illustrate what you're asking. All right, just a few more seconds. All right, it looks like most people are voting for, and I think if I click close voting, did you all see it? Did you all see the results? I think you did. It was about 87. Okay, good. About 87%. All right, now let's look at this one. Extended time. So most people said that orally instead of writing was an accommodation. What about extended time? All right, accommodation is winning. Anita, that's a good point. Teachers need to do more thinking about their essential questions in order to determine how to assess. Yes, Peggy, I'm only giving a few examples. You're right. There are lots and lots of examples of how we can provide support on assessments. Yandy, for a second grader, what type of accommodations should a teacher use? It depends on what that student needs. So we'll talk through that in just a second, but there's not a certain list that we should say these are appropriate for second graders. All right, it looks like 88% said accommodation. All right, and here's the last one. What about fewer questions? Accommodation or modification? Oh, I think, well, modifications is winning on this one. So it looks like accommodations won on the first two, and modifications is winning on this one. All right, 80%, almost 80% said modifications on this one. All right, I should have put a poll for this. Don't answer this in the chat box, okay? But how many of you figured out this is a trick question? So a lot of times you see lists of accommodations or modifications, but really you can't answer this question unless you know what's being measured. So is it an accommodation or modification that you're providing on your assessments? It depends on what you're measuring. Accommodations do not fundamentally alter the grade level standard. They level the playing field. So the football field is here. Sorry for those of you not in the U.S. I have two American game examples, but the football field is here because accommodations level the playing field. Those of you who are wearing glasses today, your glasses are functioning as an accommodation. They're providing you with access to the material. they are not making it easier for you to consume the material than for everybody else. They don't give you superpowers. They simply provide you access. Modifications, on the other hand, fundamentally alter the grade level standard. And you're right, we can think about this even for students who are beyond. Anytime we alter the grade level standard to make it significantly lower, significantly higher, we've made a modification. So when we think about this in terms of assessments, any of these could be either one. So extended time, you're right, you all mostly said it was an accommodation, and most of the time it is. But extended time, you're right, Peggy, extended time is not an accommodation because it just is inherently an accommodation. It's almost always an accommodation because we're almost never measuring rate or speed as the critical skill. There are times that we do. There are times that we care about that. But extended time is most often an accommodation. Now, don't let standardized tests confuse you. Just because a test is timed doesn't mean the critical skill we're measuring is rate or speed. Now, standardized tests like the ACT, SAT, GRE, and so forth, those are timed to give a standardized experience so that we can make comparisons between test takers. Right? And so the reason that it's an accommodation to allow extended time for a student who has a lower working memory, a lower processing speed, who has dyslexia, is that we are providing a comparable experience. We're not really interested in measuring rate or speed, but we do want a comparable experience for those students. Completing an assignment orally instead of in writing is an accommodation, as long as the critical skill we're measuring is not writing skills. As long as what we're measuring is not writing skills, then it is an accommodation. Fewer questions. I tricked you here. Everyone said this was or 80% of you thought this was a modification. And it is true that it often is a modification, but Peggy had it right on a couple of texts ago when she said you can do 20 math problems or 5 math problems and still demonstrate your understanding of how to solve the same problem, same standard, and she is exactly right. Fewer questions is an accommodation if 2 criteria are met, and Peggy alluded to this. If all of the questions measure the same skill and are of comparable difficulty, same skill, comparable difficulty, then fewer questions is serving the same function as extended time. Make sense? All right, so extended time can be a modification if what we're measuring is rate or speed. We do this sometimes. We do this in the area of fluency of both reading, fluency in math. We do make those changes. Thanks, Peggy. I'm glad. And so we do care about reading fluency. Physical education teachers measure rate or speed. We used to have to measure typing speed. We don't really have to do that anymore. But there are times where we care about rate or speed. So if I'm doing a Mad Minute math assignment where I'm trying to see how fluent a student is with multiplication facts, for example. If I add extra time onto that for a student who is struggling with dyscalculia, I've made a modification because now I'm looking at how many math problems the student can do in a longer period of time. So that's when it becomes a modification. Completing an assignment orally instead of in writing is a modification if we're measuring writing skills. So if we've given an assignment, or if we have an assessment where we're measuring the student's reading comprehension, and we're measuring the student's ability to make predictions or inferences with the text, and we're measuring their ability to put their thoughts together in an organized manner in paragraphs. and we allow that student to do it orally instead of in writing, we've made a nice accommodation for two of those standards. We've made a nice accommodation in terms of reading comprehension and in terms of making inferences or prediction. And so we should score that student on those standards as we score everybody else. But we have taken away the writing requirement, and so we've not collected any evidence on the student's ability to write. Absolutely, Rebecca. Absolutely. And when a student is significantly behind grade level, it is important that we make those modifications. It is a modification, but it is important that we use those when it's necessary. Anytime we have easier questions or problems, that's a modification. And similar to that, if we are, I'm not a huge proponent of multiple choice kind of traditional tests, but if we do that, and there are times when that's appropriate, and we have, if we have 4 options, A, B, C, D, and we take away half of those for a struggling learner, then that is a modification as well. And it's a modification because, let's think about that for a second. You've increased the probability of a correct guess. You've increased the probability that the student will get it right, but didn't actually know the answer. So the question, don't agree that changing the length of time is a measure of a student's fluency in math. It's simply a measure of speed of arithmetic skills. That's not the definition of fluency. Good point. So if we're trying to measure how quickly a student, how the automaticity, maybe that's a better word, so the automaticity of math facts, if we're trying to measure that, and even within reading, pace is only one part of fluency, right? It's one part. So is intonation, so is being able to read phrases rather than reading each word one by one. So you're right, that automaticity of math facts is only one piece of fluency. So you're exactly right. Thank you for pointing that out. There you go. So and so probably a lot of us either have family connections or other close personal connections with people who could benefit from accommodations or modifications. So yes, sometimes we give those common adaptations that can be classified as accommodations. Those are just access. When we give those accommodations, we score those assessments and give feedback based on the grade level standard. Nothing really changes other than we provide the student with that appropriate access. And the way that we do that for the person who asked earlier, what do I do for a second grader who needs accommodations? We ask, what is the manifestation of the disability? What does it affect? And if it's affecting other areas of the student's performance, if a student's disability in reading is affecting their performance in social studies or other parts of the curriculum, we do our best to take away that reading requirement so that we can accurately measure their performance in these other areas of the curriculum. All right, so sometimes though, we have to measure something different. Sometimes students are not on grade level and they can complete the same task or a similar task, but we measure something different for those students. So we're assuming most students are on equal ground even when most students write or type at different rates, with different rates of automaticity at communicating. I don't know that we assume they're most on equal ground, but there is a natural distribution of skills, and most students will cluster around kind of one area, one level, and you will have students who are very different. And so we are talking about bringing our assessments to the level of all learners. Okay, so sometimes we have to have a different measure. And what we're asking here, what we ask as teachers as we think about our assessments is, what is the highest comparable criterion that this student can achieve? And we calibrate our assessment on that target. So if we lean on a target of students will fluently read passages containing grade level words, yes, I recognize that reading pace is only one part of that, but it is a big part of it. It's an important part of it, and it is predictive of later success, as is pace with math facts. So we have to infer the grade level criteria. So we would think about what is our learning target for a piece of this. And we might say, I want students to read grade level passages at least 150 words per minute. Well, based on our data, Maisie is reading it at 40 words per minute right now. And so that's not a reasonable expectation for Maisie by the end of this year. So we modify and say we expect that Maisie will read at 80 words correctly per minute this academic year, knowing that we want her to read on grade level eventually or the closest that she can, but we want to set a comparably difficult criterion. We can do this with any assessment, any learning target we have. We can think about what's the expectation for the class. What do our data on this student suggest that this student is able to do? What's their target? And how can I bring this assessment to that student's level? So I'll take an example. I'll give you an example of one that's even more different than this. What about if I assess, Lisa asks, what if I assess the same information orally and then do another assessment of the same information in a written test? Can that be considered differentiated assessment because more than one assessment is offered for students to show their knowledge? You could offer two different modes to assess that information, and that would be differentiated for those who are. As long as you're not measuring writing skills, that would provide access for those students who are better at showing that knowledge orally than in writing. And Lisa, no, students don't have to have an IEP. Remember, we want to differentiate for any student who is, as someone brought up earlier, behind or beyond. And behind does not only mean those who have diagnosed disabilities, and a lot of times those students don't require different assessments, but any student who is significantly behind grade level on a critical skill. Great, I'm glad you like that, Violetta. All right, so just to give you another example, in science, in sort of middle-ish grades or upper elementary middle-ish grades, we teach students to classify minerals. And so we teach them to use something called Mohs hardness scale to classify minerals, right? So, and yes, 504 plans do provide students with access to accommodations, modifications as well. So at this point, I'm going to quit answering questions and move on since Adrian has given me my 5-minute warning. But a student who is not on grade level may not be able to classify minerals using Mohs hardness scale. Let's say we have a student who has Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities, far below grade level. We can still use that same task, but we can measure something different. We're talking about classifying, grouping, and sorting. And we could have that student use the same materials and still classify and sort, but instead of using Mohs hardness scale, this student classifies based on characteristics of color, texture, size, weight. So the same standard, the same skill, but the criteria is different. And then we also do this when students are in higher level classes like AP classes. Sometimes we're actually giving them a different task. So when I'm thinking about gifted students, we often do this. When we give a completely different task, and this is for the smallest number of students, we need to give a completely different task. When we're using hands-on tasks and materials, it's so easy to find a different, comparably difficult outcome that a student can work toward within that same task. But sometimes we do have to give a different task. And when we do that, we want to try to find a different task that is as authentic as possible. It's the best alternative assessment when we can be authentic. Often we're having to give a different task because a student has intellectual disabilities, is significantly behind, and so we can do that. We need to be as authentic as possible. Amy, just very quickly, how do we prepare students for standardized tests when they're not differentiated? Remember that standardized tests are not, they're designed to measure how's the student performing on grade level. And so that test asks a different question. It has a completely different purpose than those in your classroom, which is which are designed to ask, how is this student performing on the highest level of work that they can complete? All right, so authentic assessment measures how students are performing in natural learning opportunities, and I want to give you a quick analogy. This is a billboard you might see on the side of the road. It's stuck there in your natural environment. This ad is different, qualitatively different. Bic Razor ad with the lawn mowed to it. This one is different. Benjamin Moore paint ad. This one is different. These are all qualitatively different. It's not just an assessment stuck there for the purpose of measuring. It's taken the environment and made it a source for the ad. So instead of just sticking an ad in the environment, we're using the environment as a source for the ad. So just instead of just coming up with another assessment, we want to think about that student's natural experiences, interests, and find natural ways to use those as a source for our data, a source for alternate assessments. Mr. Clean ad, my favorite one here. This is a group of students I met in Hong Kong. These students were out with their English teacher, and they went to a touristy area where I was, and the teacher pointed at me and said, "Her, go ask her." And so they all ran up to me and started asking me questions. Do you like Hong Kong? Have you been to Hong Kong before? And they were writing down their answers. This was an authentic measure of their ability to use English, and they were just so excited that it was working, that their English was working. And so we want to try to find authentic options. So when a student who has visual impairment can't participate in an assessment using a microscope to identify or classify or describe, what kind of different task can we give that's tactile or auditory, where the student can demonstrate some of the same skills but through a different task? All right, I've tried to answer questions along the way. This is my contact information, my Twitter handle, my website. I greatly appreciate your attending today, and hopefully you got some ideas and got your wheels turning about how you might differentiate assessment.